Okay, welcome everybody. This is exciting. This is a big crowd for Ocean and Cara. Welcome to the Brattleboro Literary Festival. I'm Robert Parks. I'm the president of the board of directors, and this year's festival is made possible by the generous support of our festival sponsors: Brattleboro Community Television, Jenny Altschuler and Barry Green, Elizabeth Catlin, the Stupinski Family Trust, the Vermont Humanities Council, and poets and writers. We would also like to thank our advertisers, and we encourage you to support them. This particular event is being sponsored by the Brattleboro Retreat, and we're very excited to have them present the event. Our festivals run entirely by volunteers, and we have very real expenses as well in putting authors up in hotels and transporting them and renting some of the venues. So we do need support from year to year, and we'd love to have you make a donation in one of our donation boxes in the back sometime this weekend, or you can also use the QR code to donate online through our website. You know the drill. Please check your phone to double check it and make sure that the ringer is off, but keep it out because you're free to take photos for social media and bump our presence online. It would be a good help. And I'm very excited about our event around Ocean Vuong's book, The Emperor of Gladness. Ocean Vuong is the author of 2 poetry collections, as well as the New York Times bestselling novels On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous, and The Emperor of Gladness, which is an Oprah pick. Born in Saigon, Vietnam, he currently splits his time between Northampton, Massachusetts, and New York City. He's going to be in conversation with Cara Blue Adams, who's the author of You Never Get It Back, which was named a New York Times Editor's Choice and awarded the John Simmons Short Fiction Prize. Let me talk just a little bit about The Emperor of Gladness, a wonderful book. The book takes place in a small town on the Connecticut River and talks a lot about New England. And the main character, Hai, gets a job at a restaurant called Home Market. Audience participation. Thanks very much. And he makes a second family at Home Market. To quote from the book, just like people anywhere else in New England, this second family is weather-worn, perennially exhausted, or pissed off, or both. So I love that description of New England. And before I bring both folks up, I want to mention the last paragraph of the review in NPR. The Emperor of Gladness is a truly great novel about work, a still under-acknowledged topic in American fiction. Hard work is supposed to get you somewhere. That's part of the promise of America. But the payoff feels much less certain to these characters. A winning lottery ticket, an inheritance, maybe even a union would have come along to propel these characters to a place of greater possibility. In Vuong's achingly austere artistic vision leaves it to his readers to imagine a better world he won't let himself depict in the pages of this wonderful novel. Can I invite Cara and Ocean up?
Hi, everyone. Is this on? Can people hear me okay? Okay. How's that? Is that better? Okay. Louder? All right, I'll try to project from the diaphragm. Thank you all so much for being here. I live in New York now, but I actually grew up in Putney, just down the road, and so this festival is just such a special occasion every year. I'm so thrilled to be in conversation with Ocean. Ocean, thank you for being here.
Hello, thank you.
There we go. It feels very New England that the mics are taking a little bit of time to warm up to the to our voices. I first read Ocean's work shortly before getting married, and I was finding that I was having a hard time focusing on anything because there was so much on my mind. Okay, how's that? Is that better? Yeah, okay. So I opened his first novel, On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous, and after not having been able to focus on a book for a few months, I was just blown away by the kind of thrill of the talent, the voice on the page, and I'm sure many of you have had that same experience. So I was so excited to read his new novel, The Emperor of Gladness. And Ocean, I wanted to start by asking you just a very simple question, which is how this novel began. I've heard you discuss this in interviews a little bit, and I thought that would be a nice place for us to start.
Oh, well, thank you so much. Thank you for just being here, and thank you to the Brattleboro Literary Festival. The word Brattleboro does occur in this book. I know we have very keen readers here. I must say thank you to this community. And when I was working on this book, I have friends through town, and words in this book were typed at Mocha Joe's. Thank you so much for the workers there. Thank you so much to the workers at Mocha Joe, where I scribbled some of these words in earlier drafts of this book. Yes, how did this start? Gosh, it's hard to say how any book starts. I guess for me, I was deeply interested in creating a novel that did not allow escape to be a plot point, for a community to close in on itself, because I think to me so much of American life, despite the myth that we live in, which is American exceptionalism, possibility, so much American life is actually about being stuck, at least in my experience. I've known people who worked the same job for 20 years, drive the same car, but their lives are not futile. They're not doomed. In fact, many live quite beautiful, rich lives. And so I wanted to depict that story. And also around addiction. I don't have to tell this community, how much of a struggle it is in New England, the first place to be blasted by what is now called the opioid epidemic. Of course, back then, it was more like this invisible plague that would take us out overnight in the early aughts. But there's a kind of moral corruption when we often think about people struggling with addiction. It is a disease, of course, but unlike a battle with cancer, which is often depicted as virtuous, the addict is somehow morally corrupt. And that goes against my experience as well. So many people who struggle with addiction still grow internally, even as their struggle continues to worsen. And so there was this kind of incongruent relationship between health and moral aptitude. And I wanted to kind of depict that someone could still continue to be ill, but still grow as a person. That just because we lose them to this sort of slaughter, this pharmaceutical slaughter, it doesn't mean that their life is entirely worthless. And I never saw that in the news segments, and I thought fiction is a wonderful place to kind of You know, fiction, if nothing else, is a control of speed. It's about acceleration and deceleration. And where you decelerate is where value accrues. So how a story slows down, how you describe, I think description is so political. How you describe the world imbues it with value and information. And so I wanted to just slow down, and I did not want this small town in New England to be a plot point that someone escapes from. I wanted to be the entire ecosystem. And I was inspired by, of course, Thornton Wilder's Our Town. And I was really surprised that Wilder was inspired by the Japanese no drama. And further, that we in America received the Japanese no drama, and Wilder picked it up in the 30s because of a president, Ulysses S. Grant, who on his first trip to Japan was immediately shown a no play. And in his kind of quintessential military laconic tone, after the show, Grant brings his assistant over and says, whatever that was, we must preserve it. And so I thought it was just such an interesting thing. And of course, the Civil War haunts this book as well. But I was deeply surprised but inspired by Wilder because it was so innovative for an American playwright to look to an Eastern format, to then create this sort of stripped down, surreal, anti-plot story that would go on to become the most performed play in American history. At any given time, the most performed American play. I think Shakespeare, unfortunately, beats him out. But at any given time, I believe there are at any given time over 200 renditions of Our Town being played from elementary school onward. And I thought it was so courageous for an American playwright to do that, to take. It was so strange that early reviews didn't even bring themselves to call it a play. One review in New York called it Thornton Wilder's Chinese stunt. Which I thought was so fascinating. But what I loved about that play was that it was all deceleration. There was no story, but character. There were people. And it goes against every quintessential writing workshop. That story must have conflict and plot. And I think if you live in a community, and if you know it enough, you know that existing itself is hard enough. And that to have people be in proximity with each other and to articulate their dreams and ambitions is in itself enough conflict to tell a robust story. And I was just so amazed that that came over 100 years ago. And I've always felt that I'm not so much interested in the American dream as it is sold to us. I'm more interested in Americans who dream. And I think in Our Town, that legacy was really such a foundational moment for me, and I kept returning to that as inspiration for this book.
Mm-hmm. That's incredible to hear. Thank you for sharing that. I was hoping that perhaps you would read a little bit for us as well before we begin to discuss the particulars of the book.
Okay. Well, we were talking about the opioid epidemic, and this book takes place in 2009. Mostly because I'm a very slow thinker. So if you want my Trump book, it's going to take 16 years. If we get there. Knock on wood. But it was, I was just in Europe, and all this is very exotic to Europeans, thankfully, because they didn't have to deal with this, Purdue Pharma started in Stamford, Connecticut, 20 minutes from where I grew up in Hartford. And the early salespeople who were trying to sell this poison to our communities for profit, it was meant as a cancer drug to prevent pain during cancer, but cancer doesn't make enough money, so they wanted to turn it into a pill for migraines, ankle sprains. And when doctors asked the early salespeople, is this pill abuse resistant? And instead of saying yes, which would render them legally viable to deception, they said, uh-huh. And so to me, this epidemic that has taken over 600,000 American lives began with a linguistic manipulation. It begins with what Aristotle would call poesis, poetry, right? This word, let's call it a word. It doesn't exist in the dictionary, and yet it has absolute meaning. And so the affirmation of begins this epicenter, which leads us to, this concussive death march that we are still experiencing now. The first person I saw OD was somebody's father. He was 12 and had gone over to this girl, Jennifer Knoxley's house to do a project for history class. They were in the living room cutting construction paper when her father came in very quietly, like a ghost was wheeling him in, and sat down on the couch. After a while, his head tilted back and his mouth hung open, eyes rolled into their sockets. He looked like somebody had pressed pause at the peak of him laughing at the greatest joke he'd ever heard. This was the image imprinted on High's mind when he signed in at the New Hope Recovery Center. Every generation says this of itself, but these were indeed bewildering times he lived in. A time before iPhones were everywhere, and people still looked up as they walked, their heads filled with self-generated thoughts floating up from deep pits in the subconscious. A time when you still knocked on each other's doors, and if you wanted to talk to somebody, you had to call them on a landline, listen to their mother's breathing for a while, maybe the sound of her fixing a drink or shaving her legs, then meet up somewhere, one of you waiting about, shifting your feet and looking at clouds or trees or municipal architecture. Your dopamine levels higher for not having been depleted from blue light screens throughout the day. A time when the drug dealer on the corner would, out of boredom, start balancing on the chain-link fence, the boy in him unable to help it, pants sagging from the effort, revealing his plaid boxers you can spot from the back window of the school bus. But then, slowly, 1 or 2 or 7 of your friends will find the pills, and they will flood their young brains with artificial joy. And you will join them, running through the woods by the power plant, laughing at the immense night, your head levitating a foot over your shoulders. And their eventual deaths will not yet be used by politicians to gain traction with the base. It did not have a name, this slaughter, and yet your loved ones were being slowly erased, even teachers and lunch ladies overdosing overnight. Though it was never his drug of choice. He was barely 16 the first time he did heroin. One summer night at a skate park on the outskirts of town, he had sat huddled among 3 other skater boys in the valley of a half-pipe, the candle flame still in the humid air as the spoon sizzled over it, Fugazi's waiting room running on a loop from a stereo in someone's backpack. The boys had removed their socks, turning their long, bony feet in the light, searching for a good vein. They preferred the feet because it was easier to hide the scars. Plus, they could feel the speed of the hot, acidic rush literally surging through their legs to the tip of their heads, some of them tracing the drug's ascent with their fingers as if pointing to ruined cities on a map. But the sensation for High was more like drowning in his own blood, his neck craning to get above the tide. Soon there was laughter everywhere in the dark, hands clapping bare skin. But a half hour later, the only sound left was Fugazi playing over their gleaming, shirtless chests, mouths gasping like shored fish as fireflies flittered over them in the greenish night. Rehab, if nothing else, was a place to store yourself for a while. It was also, he quickly learned, a kingdom of boredom. All the cliches about it are true. You wait around until whatever poison that's ruining you empties into the world as time. Then you fill that emptiness with more time, talking, walking around the rec room, talking some more, painting watercolors of zoo animals, reading YA or science fiction, the only genres allowed. And after all that waiting, you stand by the barred windows and watch the golden arches from the McDonald's across the parking lot light up, which means it's time for the nurses to switch shifts for the night. And an alcoholic with Down syndrome named Jordan is next to you, pointing out the window, shouting, "It's chicken tender time, it's chicken tender time, hey guys, it's tender time." The rooms are named after various genus of squash grown in New England, a laminated drawing of each type pasted on the doors. High shared the kabocha room with a sex addict named Marlon, who was strapped to the bedpost with bungee cords to keep him from jerking off. He turned to High one night and said quizzically, "Hey, man, I was wondering, how come I never see any Asians in rehab? I've been to like 5 of these joints and never seen one till now." "MSG," I said. "MSG," I said, feeling crazy. "What?" Marlon's eyes widened in the blue wet dark. "Oh yeah, it absorbs all the poison. Why do you think the government hates this stuff? They don't want you knowing the truth. Then all these places will be out of business. They make a big fuss about how it's bad for you, right? Anytime the feds say something's bad for you, eat as much of it as you can." Holy shit. Marlon sat up. "It won't work for your stuff, though." No, I get that. But what about you? You can absorb all your MSG or something? "I was adopted. Ate mostly waffles my whole life, and now I'm fucked." Damn, dude. Marlon lay silent all night, this new knowledge burrowing through him, his straps clinking on the bedpost as he tossed about.
That was wonderful. I laughed aloud reading it on the page, but what a treat to actually hear you read it aloud and to get to laugh with other people. In that passage, I think we get such a sense of the book's voice and some of your many strengths as a writer, the attention to detail, the way that you're able to move from really painful subjects to humor, and from these big questions of community and social issues down to the very particular characters who are just each extraordinary individual human beings. I thought that maybe we could start, because this book contains so much, by talking about the main character, Hai, and his relationship with Grazina, which I think of as really sort of like the skeleton or the backbone of the book. The book, I know many of you have read it already, but for those who haven't, it begins more or less with Hai wondering if he should jump off a bridge. And it's at that point, that very low point in his life, that he meets this older widow named Grazina, who has emigrated from Lithuania and who is just a totally wonderful character. So could you talk just a little bit about Hai's relationship with Grazina, which really kind of carries us through the book? It begins with them meeting, and I won't give away how it ends for those who haven't read it, but it completes, I think, the story of their relationship in a beautiful way.
Yeah, well, I grew up being raised by my grandmother, and I grew up in a neighborhood where grandmothers were the matriarchy, mostly single moms and raising sons. And what I realized was that, at least in America, the very young and the very old actually have a lot of common ground, because the young do not have a lot of assets. They don't have the qualifications to contribute to a capitalistically robust nation. And the old, the elderly, are pushed to the side, deemed defunct, and therefore no longer useful or contributors, right? This kind of strange euphemism to this utility. And, but so they have a kind of powerlessness that I think at the core leads them to a kind of absolute alienation and loneliness from this cultural center. And, but they are often, you know, side by side in the same room, and in this case in the same home, in the same condition. And there's something, I think, beautiful about finding that unexpected bond through the age gaps. I mean, they're 60 years apart. But we often talk about what is quintessentially American. It's a good question to have. It's not necessarily answerable. But of course you have the white picket fence, the Levittown, suburbia, the idea of achieving one's prosperity through hard work, pull yourself up from your bootstraps. But I also think another sector of Americanness is war. You know, try to rent an apartment in this country and you immediately enter the linguistic registry of war. This is a post-war Greek revival, right? This is an antebellum ranch, right? You mean a former plantation, right? And so we seem to measure even our art. You know, you enter any English department and you'll hear, you know, this is the greatest post-war novels of the mid-century, right? You know, what is fiction after the Civil War, what have you. So we measure progress and time by death, especially in this country. And I grew up in the shadow of 9/11 and the ensuing Iraq-Afghanistan wars. And I remember that war being filled with mythology. You know, I was so interested in the surreal aspects of how propaganda functions in our culture. And Georgina suffers from dementia. And often we say it's a lack of memory, but from my experience, having lived with and being a caretaker of someone with dementia, I think that's a misnomer. I don't think they lose memory per se, but in fact, dementia is memory without choice. It is memory without agency, right? There are memories, it's just not the ones that we deemed to be the right one, quote unquote, because the ones that we are living in linear time. So it's displaced memory, which is also somehow incredibly mimetic to the refugee condition that Georgina experiences and Hai experiences. So I think for me, the quintessential American life is two strangers from two different continents who are refugees from two wars, 40 years apart, 60 years apart in age, meet each other and ask each other, what is left of the American dream? And is it even feasible to resurrect it under one roof? And I thought, to me, that is actually the America that I've come to know, and the beauty that comes out of that quest, the beauty that comes out of that struggle is what I think is so touching to me about my understanding of the American ethos. Is two people asking, not how do we get out of here? You know, because there's a lot of folks saying, I'm gonna get out of here, right? And they have a lot of private jets to do so. They have a lot of mansions in other countries to go to. But so much of American life, but also so much of history, is filled with people who are stuck. History books are filled with people who do incredible things. Overthrow governments, break out, free people. But history itself is actually outnumbered by people who are stuck, mostly because they don't have the capacity or the agency to free themselves, stuck in coal mines, stuck in marriages they never wanted to be in, stuck fighting in wars they never chose to be in, stuck in nail salons and factories, stuck in towns. So to me, I'm interested in turning the idea of abjectness into a site of possibility. And I think throughout all of my work, I don't want to look at abjection and say, how do you ameliorate or escape that? But is there a kind of method? Is there a kind of strength in abjection itself? Is there a type of power? Of course, we should rescue each other from material deprivation and the lack of safety. But I think it doesn't mean that that place is without dignity and power. You know, like, I remember my mother raising me and my grandmother raising me, and these are women who have no English, but they taught me to be vigilant. They said, Ocean, every space you go through, you have to pay attention to every detail and pay attention to how people look at you. Then you know whether you're safe or not. And on one hand, they were responding to trauma. These are women who escaped napalm, so of course they were vigilant. But on another hand, in retrospect, as an artist, they were teaching me how to look at the world. That they were saying that, in fact, the world is inexhaustible. You can stay in one town and look at it again and again and again, and it will keep deepening, and meaning will accrue as long as you pay attention. And so I wanted to frame these two relationships stuck in this place. The house is not necessarily a cage, but a kind of doorway into another realm, and which is what memory is, in a sense.
That's beautifully said.
Thank you. Thank you.
So Hai moves in with Gregina, and that relationship ends up prompting him to get a job at a fast casual restaurant, loosely based on Boston Market, I believe, of which I think you have firsthand knowledge, called Home Market. And there I think we get to see just an excellent example of what you were just speaking to so beautifully, this group of people who in some ways are stuck, but whose lives are not without dignity and joy and humor, and who really become a kind of second found family for each other. Could you talk just a little bit about writing that community of people formed through labor and through the workplace?
Oh gosh, it's such an, thank you for that question. Labor is such an important, I think not just for me, but also, I got my BA in 19th century American literature, and the 19th century is such a fascinating, endlessly fascinating space for American art, because it was, there was this great attempt to revitalize a truly distinct American voice away from London, but still trapped in the Anglophone, right? So it's how do you create distinction while still using English? But it's also this very vexed time of the expansion of settler colonialism, the expansion of indigenous genocide, questions of slavery. What is the moral compass? What is the North Star? And so I think so much of who we are today was determined in the 19th century, particularly after the Civil War. I don't have to tell any of y'all that the election map every 4 years looks very similar to the battle maps of the Civil War, save perhaps West Virginia, right? And so to me, I think I'm deeply interested in this idea of labor making of American morality. And of course, the behemoth in the 19th century is Melville, Moby Dick. And that is, to me, such an incredible novel. To this day, it's rarely replicated. You have a novel over 500 pages about a multiracial group of laborers on this prophetic quest to light the new world that will lead them towards absolute self-destruction, right? It's almost like, to me, that novel speaks more to our times now than I think even to where Melville was speaking toward. Of course, Moby Dick was published in 1851, roughly exactly a decade before the firing on Fort Sumter. And so it was this idea that these group of laborers would then light the new world through the destruction of a mammal, which then would then destroy the entire vessel, right, in and of itself. But that novel was also filled with essayistic modes, borrowing Shakespeare's monologues. It was so strange. I think there's even a very surreal error in the novel where the ship's steering mechanism is described differently in two different passages. And some people think that's a copyright error, but I think that's actually really beautiful as a metaphor of like the ship that morphs and changes as the narrative time moves. On one hand, it's a mass steering system, and on the other hand, it's a wheel, right? I could talk about Moby Dick for days, but I think why I go back to Moby Dick is that it was a commercial failure in Melville's time. His name was famously misspelled in his obituary in the New York Times, and he sworn off fiction after Moby Dick. He started to write poetry. I'm told that I can't fact check this, but I'm told by a Melville scholar, who of course might be biased, that he wrote more lines of poetry than Whitman and Dickinson combined. I wonder if that's true, but he was devastated. He felt betrayed by fiction after the failure of Moby Dick, but it is now so symbolically fiction that if you go into the Strand bookstore, the fiction aisle is under the symbol of the sperm whale, right? And why I go back to that novel, it's a novel that gives you absolute permission, but it's a novel about labor, about work, and how labor builds circumstantial family. I think particularly after the mid-century, there's a lot of wonderful treatises about fiction around the nuclear family as a central part of American life. But I think fiction around labor, the idea of circumstantial family that you don't choose. We often say nuclear family, chosen family, but there's something actually much more foundational and large, and that is the work family, the family you have no say in, and yet is the one you spend perhaps the most time with. In order to sustain your nuclear family, you spend time with this ragtag, random group of people cobbled together. And to me, that relationship is actually something so foundational to how we experience life in this country. And I wanted to really write about that after being given permission by Melville.
One thing that I was struck by as I read the novel is that there are a number of examples of, we could call it mirroring or echoing or doubling. And I think this leads us to one important, for me at least, example of that, which is that we have this relationship that Hai has with this widow he encounters at the beginning of the book. And we have his relationship with this circumstantial family formed through labor. We also have what I think of as sort of like the heart or the lungs of the book, which is his relationship with his mother, from whom he is not quite estranged, but separated through his choice. And so on the one hand, we have his relationship with this older widow he's taking care of and living with. And he's calling his mother, who lives nearby, but who believes that he's elsewhere, attending medical school. And we have this circumstantial family that he's spending time with, and some actual family members as well. But this one really central relationship is one that he's not able to access in a way. Could you talk a little bit about that relationship, Hai's relationship with his mother?
Yeah, as a queer person, I've have a very intimate relationship to shame, and I think to me there's two different kinds of shame, and there's a shame of conduct. Like if you do something shameful, if you do something harmful, that shame could be very productive. If you forsake someone, if you behave poorly, shame could then propel you to revise and revitalize and correct. So often we think shame as a kind of debilitating obstacle, but in some cases, shame becomes a propulsive force. The other, often what queer people experience is shame of being, right? Not from what you do, but who you are, which you can't change. So that shame, we have to work to heal ourselves from and to move from. And but there's two different kinds. But I'm interested in trying to reclaim shame as a potential site of power, again, this thing that's supposed to be abjection, as a motivating, propulsive force. And in this book, he's too ashamed to confront his failures to his mother, but it leads him into an entirely new world. So I'm interested in seeing these things that we are supposed to disabuse ourselves from and asking of them, is there an energy source there? Is there a thing there? Because similarly, I think about my friend, the poet Ricky Laurentiis speaks beautifully about this, and they call it bottom poetics, when they said the idea that the bottom is the most abject position in queer discourse, because it is the penetrating partner, which is for Ricky brilliantly connects it to misogyny, right? Because it's it's why would someone born male want to be that close to the opposite sex, to be that close to women, right? Surely that's some kind of flaw, and the homophobia that comes out of it is a deep hatred of women, right? Of that sort of transgression. Then you have this idea that anything that is valuable in the American ethos, the John Waynes, the Supermans, we need our version of it, right? So you have the Wonder Woman, which is the female version of Superman. You have, I'm interested in why Bruce Lee is so palatable. I love Bruce Lee. I'm grateful for Bruce Lee, but it's not a surprise that a macho fighter who destroys all with a single 1-inch punch is acceptable as the Asian version of Asian excellence. And I guess I'm more interested in saying, well, what if we turn away from that model and have a different model? Is there soft power? Is there power in bottomhood? Is there power in abjection? Is there something in the gutter that is actually a fertile ground for things to grow, right? Is there a manure that is actually the essential part of life? And I'm so interested in asking that in the same, lexicon of shame. And likewise, I think so much of this book is about the shame of confronting each other, the shame of estrangement in families, and the innovation that can come out of shame. And I think shame is a really useful thing if we allow it, if we re-examine it as a mode that could be applicable. As far as I'm concerned, a little bit of shame could go a long way in the right house right now. My goodness, just an ounce. Could you imagine? And so again, if we go in, if we don't just say, this is, if we don't examine the word and we just say, this word comes with baggage, it's bad, no. If we look at shame, what is it at its core? The shame of conduct. It's to actually recognition. Oh, I have wronged. I have lied. I have forsaken people. Now there's actually an illumination at the center of it. How do I do better? I feel the same way with regret. Often growing up as a thoroughly American boyhood, my friends would often say, no regrets. No regrets, bro. And I just thought, actually, regret is really helpful. I tell my students this, they say, gosh, professor, I hate all the poems I wrote last year. I said, that's a beautiful thing. That means you've grown. That means you've recognized your growth. and you've seen the distance between your past self and your current self. And now, the beautiful agency is that you get to revitalize that space. You get to update that space so that you can make work that truly represents you where you are now. And I think I'm interested in returning to words that have been sort of tossed out and seeing if they have potentiality. In this sense, bottom poetics is so important to me. Abjection as sites of power. Ricky would go on to say, out of all the things we can describe about the bottom of the slave ship, it is a place of horror, abjection. Ricky learned as a Black poet. As a site of horror, of humanity at its most corrupt and horrific, it was also, amongst all those horrible things, a language lab. It was a time for these tribes to come together and to form a site of communication towards liberation. And Ricky goes on to say, to them, that is the beginning of African American literature, is that space. And I'm so moved by that because, like, from that thesis, you can apply it to every sector of American life and say, even in the most, demonic space and conduct, there is a site of agency if you return to it and see it as a place of innovation.
Well, I'd love to ask you many more questions, but I also want to give the audience a chance to ask you a few of their own. So perhaps we'll open it up with the time that we have remaining. And I'm not sure, do we have a mic going around? Oh, terrific. So a volunteer will come around with a mic.
So, thank you. And just in response to shame, it's almost like kindness is one of your characters. There are just so many kind characters. And the demonstration of that kindness, or the evil character, the mean people you sprinkle through the story. And one of them is Linda McMahon. And it's in 2009, it's long before she was given the green light to destroy public education. Could you talk about how she made it into the book?
Well, Linda McMahon is a familiar specter in Connecticut life. She, of course, runs WWE wrestling, which functions in this book. Wrestling becomes a kind of allegory for so much of American life. It's violence through hallucination, but there's also a beauty to it. You know, I go to my local amateur wrestling association held in a VFW as much as I can. And to me, it's like watching a passion play. It's watching, they're like poets. Wrestlers like poets. They're paid just as much. And then to throw their bodies, all over. So I was like, I recognize, that struggle. And Linda tried. I'm really proud of Connecticut because she failed in her gubernatorial race. She spent, but of course, there's ways. I would have never predicted, where she would end up in 2009. I thought that was the end of it. But I think that's also, it's also, I think that someone asked a question last night at my friend Sally Winmouth's reading, and how do we survive? And I think it's so important to ask also of that question, to also think of that through that question, because it's a question I think we all always want to ask. But who are the we, and what does survive mean, and for whom, and for someone as privileged and powerful, a billionaire like Linda McMahon can survive perennially. right? No matter the failures. Whereas so many of our local businesses, mom and pops, one misstep and you're out of luck and that's the end. You don't get a second chance. And so I think the core, the ethos is that if you are wealthy enough, that you are kind of invincible to failure, or your failures is part of the texture of your life. And so I think, in one hand, I was surprised that she is still relevant. On another hand, it's very predictable that someone like that would still be around, and that if they lose, quote unquote, here, they ends up winning somewhere else. And I think it goes further to this idea of, America does not have folklore, that a redeeming folklore for the ill, the abject, and the poor. Whereas other countries, there's always the wise fool, the court jester who actually tells the truth, right? In England, the jester could tell the truth because he's a fool. As he's able to, disguise the truth. In classical Greek, we have Tiresias, blind, intergender, beggar, but clairvoyant. So when someone is so outside of the social norm, in other cultures, they actually gain power. That ejection from the social gives them a kind of clairvoyance outside of time. But America does not have that, And I think in Europe, even in Europe, you have hagiography, the stories of saints who are often also outsiders, beggars, poor folks, people who've done taboo. So hagiography is also the folklore that redeems impoverishment. Whereas here, we never had that. Part of it is because we're such a young country. The saints didn't arise here. So what we did was that we created folklore out of the founding fathers, which become a propaganda. I remember as a student in New England learning about George Washington's wooden teeth. Little did I know that was a myth that hid a much darker, sinister reality, was that his teeth was actually his fake dentures were actually made from enslaved people's teeth. And that the story about the cherry tree was made up by his first biographer to showcase his humility and honesty. So because we lacked a folklore that redeemed a dignified position for the poor, we created a propagandic folklore that gave power and mythos to land-owning, people-owning, wealthy men, right? So we are still wrestling in that today. No American politician will be successful criticizing the founding fathers, right, to this day. So what that tells us a lot. I don't judge it. I'm not interested in condemning. I don't think it's the role of the poet, because it's condemnation is, of course there are things we should condemn, but when we're looking at culture as it evolves, I'm interested in just seeing it and witnessing it as it is, and asking the question, why is it like that? And does it have to be like that tomorrow? And what are the benefits of asking a different question? And so right now, in my short 37 years, I have not seen, America offer a kind of dignified mythos to people on the outside. You do have counterculture. You do have the beats, the black arts movements, but those countercultures are reactions to a lack of that folklore. So the question is, the folklore never existed from the beginning. What do we do now? And I think for me, the answer is we have to keep telling stories that take power away from that propaganda. To me, Mount Rushmore is such an emblematic a symbol of this question, because there is nothing that says more, that screams loudly, small dick energy, than I mean, really, to think about it, like to deface a beautiful, natural, millennia, millennias of work in this beautiful mountain, to create a testament of absolute power and nationalism, actually inside that is a recognition. It's a deep recognition that you see also in the White House too, the bombasticness. I think in its core, there is a deep recognition that all of this is founded on a false dream. You know, America's really good at PR. We are the policemen of the world. We are the moral high ground. But meanwhile, we have destroyed, you know, independent countries. We have used the CIA to foil independent workers' rights all over Latin America and Africa. And so I think inside that symbol is actually a deep recognition that, you know, we don't have a folklore. We had to make one. We had to invent one, which is why memory in America is very, very vexed. To remember well, we have to remember that we are a country founded on the attempt of indigenous genocide and the enslavement of human beings. That's really hard to swallow, right? So what do we create? We create Make America Great Again. The performance of memory that's actually nostalgia via amnesia. But that's why it's so intoxicating. I do sympathize with however many, 51% of our fellow citizens who fell for it. I sympathize greatly. I live in Western Mass, you know, very similar to life here. You know, we are a lovely little college town, but you drive 20 minutes and you'll see Trump voters. You know, you hire someone to fix your door, they'll come with a MAGA hat. And through the 10 years of Trump's legacy as a politician, I've been able to ask this question of people from ages 17 all the way to their 70s. Where was the again? Where was the again for you? And I mean that seriously, you know, because you're going to be in my house. Here you are, you're working, what have you. We're going to be here for a few hours. We might as well talk. And they come wearing the MAGA hat, right? And I said, just tell me where the again is. And 90% of the time, something very interesting happens in the response. People from all ages, and I've asked, you know, 17-year-olds, teenagers, all the way to people in their 70s, and they almost always describe the years they became teenagers. And it's for every person, it's a different time. If you're very young, it's 2004. Sometimes it's 1996, the 80s, 70s, 60s, right? And so really fascinating that this idea of nostalgia, but what are they really saying? You know, when you look at the years before teenage years, you're talking about childhood. This is the time before they lost their grandparents, before they got fired, before they endured the humiliation of realizing that they live in the wrong part of town, that they are poor. And not all of them are white. There are many people of color in these ranks. So it's actually an incredible moment of linguistic innovation, right? And I would say that Trump, too, is a poet. Not all poets are virtuous. Poetry itself is not a virtuous endeavor, right? Virgil, who wrote a beautiful Aeneid, was a piece of nationalistic propaganda. You know, he was asked by Augustus Caesar to write an epic poem that legitimized the crumbling Roman Empire, and he did that. So it's important to say that even as a poet myself, we are all historically have been captured. And so, you know, just like the pharmaceutical, Make America Great Again is a powerful, intoxicating linguistic poesis because it is nebulous enough for any citizen to project their timeline, their childhood, onto that space. And so if you are a citizen who feels forgotten by the status quo, who feels forgotten by the DNC or what have you, you know, because Democrats came from working class roots. If you feel that way, it's so intoxicating for a billionaire to come to you and say, I shall do the impossible, the metaphysical impossibility, and I will restore your childhood. I will give you the painless years back. And when you have no other place to go to, it's very easy to fall for that. And so I think that there is no neutral language. We are all working in propaganda. We work for, there's people who create propaganda to get your votes, to get you to pay for things, to buy a certain thing, to take your money for profit. Poets, in my eyes, are also propagandists, but we are propagandists in favor of bewilderment, joy, perplexity, communal collaboration. So there is no neutral ground, but the question that I'm interested in linguistically is what will we wield the language towards? And that is what makes me truly exciting. And I tell my students there's poetry everywhere. It's not just in the classroom. It happens all over. I mean, they're using Walt Whitman to sell Levi's jeans. They're using Walt Whitman to sell Apple, right? iPads. For the record, I think Walt would have approved. In his own lifetime, he approved Walt Whitman popcorn, Walt Whitman cigars. He licensed his likeness on a wagon. They drove around Camden with it. Anyways, I'm getting off the rails here. But I think at the core of it, the power of language, and I know I'm going over time, so maybe I'll end with this, is that, there's war does not begin with gunfire. It does not begin with violence. Violence are actions. Unfortunately, we live in a country where there's shootings every day, but not all the shootings begin wars. Wars are begun with language. Because you need to create a system, a linguistic system. You need to create speeches, radio programs, manifestos, essays, in order to convince each other linguistically that a group of people are deserving of death. And that takes language to do. So that's why I think language is our oldest and most capacious technology. You can invent the greatest medicine, the most powerful AI, robots, pharmaceuticals. You can invent the greatest thing, but only through language will you convince each other to live or die for these things. And that is the beginning and the end of our species. Thank you. Thank you.
Books will be for sale and signed in the little parlor room over there. There's going to be a parlor room where the books, you can buy Emperor Gladness and have it signed over there. So there you go.